This presentation is largely based on my PhD research on self-report measures, with some practical insight from Cricket Australia, where I currently work as their research specialist. Today I'll talk through the theory, which includes why monitor athletes, what are we trying to monitor with self-report, is self-report any good, are there other benefits of self-report, and are there contraindications to using self-report? We'll then move on to practice. So how to decide if self-report is suitable for your sport setting, how to choose a self-report measure, and how to effectively implement self-report. Why monitor athletes? As you are aware, it is not just the balance of training and recovery that determine how an athlete will perform, but non-training stress and the multitude of individual factors all influence the athlete. This manifests as a positive or negative response with outcomes on performance, health, and well-being. Athlete monitoring is used in an attempt to have a greater understanding and control over these many factors. This table gives a simplified overview of the athlete response continuum. On the left side, we have insufficient training with resulting underperformance. Shifting towards the right, we get to a point of training which results in acute fatigue, which takes days to recover, after which the athlete's performance is improved. Further to the right, we get to overtraining, with the fatigue taking months to recover, and ultimately performance is decreased. Typically, coaches are after that sweet spot of training, or the green part of the arrow. As athletes progress towards the right, or the red, it is not just performance that is affected. There are also physical and psychological signs and symptoms. Signs and symptoms associated with progression towards overtraining syndrome include, but are not limited to, reduced performance, increased sense of effort, fatigue, impaired concentration, muscle soreness, reduced appetite, disturbed sleep, and mood disturbance. Another possible negative outcome is burnout. Excessive training stress is one possible cause of burnout. However, research on athlete burnout has placed a greater focus on psychosocial factors from non-training stresses, such as life events, work, money, and social conflict. Athlete burnout is characterized by emotional and physical exhaustion, a reduced sense of accomplishment, and sport devaluation. Signs and symptoms include mood disturbance, reduced motivation, a sense of lack of control over athletic preparation, and dysfunctional behaviours such as cheating during training sessions. Many of the signs and symptoms of overtraining and burnout may be evaluated by self-report. To understand if self-report is any good at monitoring signs and symptoms of where an athlete is on the athlete response continuum, we conducted a systematic review. We included 56 studies which monitored athletes using a subjective measure, which was validated in the literature, and also had a concurrent objective measure such as performance or bloods. The studies were quite different in their methods and reporting, so couldn't be easily compared. So we created a method to categorize the study quality and level of evidence for each relationship reported, and then compiled all the findings. Firstly, I'll show you the overall results for the relationship between objective measures and training load. The symbols reflect the direction of the relationship, and the number of symbols reflects the strength of the relationship. So for endocrine markers, which were reported by 23 studies, there was moderate evidence that they did not change with an acute increase or decrease in training load. There was limited conflicting evidence of response to chronic training load. The overall impression I want you to take from this table is that, with the exception of performance, objective measures did not consistently respond to training load. By comparison, the three most common subjective measures, the profile of mood states, recovery stress questionnaire for athletes, and the daily analysis of life demands for athletes, were shown to be sensitive and consistent in their response to training load, particularly acute training load changes. So with an acute increase in training load, self-reported symptoms got worse. And with an acute decrease in training load, self-reported symptoms improved. To put this in a hypothetical example, let's consider a pre-competition training camp. With a week of intensive training, plus the stress of the training camp environment, we would expect self-reported symptoms to get worse. If this is the expected response, how you can use self-report is to pick up the unexpected response. For example, if one athlete's symptoms get a lot worse than other athletes at the camp, this can prompt you to investigate if the training is excessive for that individual athlete, or perhaps there are other stresses affecting the athlete which you should be aware of. If one athlete's symptoms do not get worse, this can prompt you to investigate if the athlete isn't being sufficiently stressed by training. Moving to the taper week with a decrease in training, we would expect self-reported signs and symptoms to improve. If one athlete's symptoms do not improve, this can prompt you to investigate if other factors are at play, or you need to further decrease their training or increase their recovery. Following our review of self-report measures which were validated in the literature, another research team conducted a similar review of measures which were not empirically derived, but are more commonly used in sports settings as they seem more practical. These single-item measures use general terms such as mood and stress, which are open to interpretation by athletes and staff. The researchers found that each different sport team had their own take on the specific questions they asked and the response scales. Additionally, variable methods and analysis made synthesizing the data difficult, but their overall findings are illustrated in the figure, which lists the most common single items on the x-axis and the size of the relationship with training load on the y-axis. The color of the circles reflect negative relationships in white and positive relationships in grey, and the size of the circles reflect the number of observations. As you can see, very variable findings across the studies, with a slight lean towards negative relationships, i.e. the self-reported items get worse when training load increases. The literature has focused on how self-reported signs and symptoms reflect training load. But is self-report associated with other outcomes such as performance, injury, or illness? From a quick, non-systematic review of the literature in elite athletes, I have summarized some studies which have looked at the relationship between self-reported symptoms and performance, injury, or illness. Each of these studies have their limitations, whether it be the use of a custom measure, small number of athletes, relatively short study period with few injuries or illnesses, or the possibility that self-report led to interventions which biased the outcomes. Then on top of these, we know the outcomes themselves are the result of so many factors that cannot be controlled in elite sport settings. At Cricket Australia, we have also had a look at the data thanks to a large, well-established database. Again, noting the limitations mentioned on the previous slide, it is more to get a feel for the data but not draw any conclusions. Looking back over 3 to 5 seasons, we looked at wellness scores in the 30 days preceding each time loss injury and illness. The x-axis of the figures counts down the 30 days from left to right. The y-axis reflects the self-reported wellness of players. For both male and female players, in the red, you can see that wellness seems to drop in the few days before illness. There was no change in wellness before injuries. Note this is group level data with variability reflected by the error bars. In practice, you'd look at individual level data. And if a player was self-reporting poorer wellness, then this would be a prompt to investigate further and intervene if needed, regardless of whether or not you knew illness was imminent. Whilst neat relationships between self-reported symptoms and what that means would be convenient, in practice we know athletes and athletic preparation is far too complex for this. The numbers reported on a self-report measure need to be interpreted by a skilled practitioner with knowledge of the greater context. For example, the individual training load and phase of training, how the athlete normally self-reports, what other stresses the athlete may be experiencing, such as injury or a life event, and also whether they are deviating from the trend of their peers. So if the data alone from a self-report isn't straightforward, are there other benefits of using self-report? To understand more about the process of using a self-report measure, I interviewed 30 elite Australian athletes, coaches, and sports science and medicine staff. Themes from the interviews were that self-report measures were used for athletes to communicate with staff. Sometimes athletes weren't comfortable raising an issue with staff directly, but they knew if they put a seed of information in their self-report measure, this would give the staff a heads up, and the staff may then initiate conversation. This communication extended to keeping all staff on the same page, as some staff may not be present with the athlete at their daily training environment. If everyone was on the same page and could see that the athlete was tracking well, then both athletes and staff would be more confident in their preparations. Self-report was also a link in the mixed methods approach to athlete preparation. For example, an athlete reporting increased fatigue may trigger conversations amongst sports staff about training load, sleep hygiene, recovery strategies, and energy availability. The process of using a self-report measure could be summarized by the figure on the right. Athletes record the data, staff review the data, place it in context, and then act if indicated. And this cyclical process repeats. This process of using a self-report measure, which we identified, which is now on the left of the screen, has similarities with self-regulation theory on the right. But instead of requiring staff to review, contextualize, and decide on any actions, the athlete may take these steps themselves. For example, an athlete may record that they are more fatigued than normal. Reflect on this. Acknowledge that they have been staying up too late on their phone, then choose to act on this by going to bed earlier the next night. This ties into the concept of the 24/7 athlete, where their everyday behaviours can impact how they respond to training. Self-report can be useful to make athletes more aware of their behaviours outside of training. To test the theory of self-report measures having a role in athlete self-regulation, we provided a new self-report measure to a range of athletes in the community and had them complete a questionnaire at 0, 4, 8, and 16 weeks. The questionnaire used empirical measures to assess the components of self-regulation theory on the left of the table. We observed an initial drop in satisfaction and intrinsic motivation after 4 weeks of using the self-report measure. We hypothesized that the self-report measure may have made some athletes more aware that they weren't tracking as well as they may have thought. This may have been the prompt they needed to improve their training or their 24/7 behaviors. Satisfaction and intrinsic motivation were back at baseline levels by week 8. Athletes who used the self-report measure had increased confidence from baseline at weeks 4, 8, and 16. When we analysed by athlete subgroup, we noted that higher level athletes didn't experience the same degree of initial discomposure, and their confidence was higher. Perhaps a result of the self-report measure reinforcing they were tracking well. Individual sport athletes who were using the self-report measure for themselves, with no staff oversight, had the greatest increase in confidence. Perhaps athletes who had staff overseeing their self-report measure had less need to engage in self-regulation. It is encouraging that athletes who use the self-report measure may have improved their ability to self-regulate and felt more confident. However, this finding also reflects that athletes who had poor compliance or did not use the self-report measure may have experienced self-regulation failure. This leads us to contraindications to using self-report. Current research does not suggest self-report measures pose any risk of adverse effects to the athlete. However, the possibility cannot be discounted. Use of a self-report measure may be contraindicated in certain circumstances, such as an athlete who is relentless in their pursuit and sets unattainable standards for themselves, or an athlete predisposed to anxiety or depression. Deliberately drawing attention to an unfavorable state, such as soreness, may exacerbate the physical symptoms and heighten anxiety, detracting from normal coping mechanisms. It is therefore recommended that athletes, coaches, and sports programs use their best judgment in determining whether it is appropriate to use a self-report measure given the individual characteristics of the athlete they're working with. A lack of staff expertise may compromise the ability to interpret and utilize the data. For instance, if a sports psychologist is not part of the support team, some may question whether psychometric questions can be effectively interpreted. Going back to my interview study, some interviewees raised concerns that the coach was not qualified to use a self-report data on their own. Therefore, if a coach was not supported by sports science and medicine staff, use of a self-report measure should be carefully considered to avoid a coach having to step outside of their expertise. Another contraindication to using a self-report measure is if it is implemented poorly. We'll go into detail of what this means in the next section. So we have summarized the theory of monitoring athletes through self-report. Now we will move on to how it fits in practice. For this section, it will be helpful to reflect on your specific sport setting. Is self-report suitable for your sport setting? There should be a clear need for the data and what it will be used for. Will it be used to inform practices on a daily basis, or with a longer-term perspective of improving understanding of athletic preparation for the future? If there is a clear need, next, is the coaching team committed to the process? This is of utmost importance. Following this, buy-in of athletes, support staff, and the sports organisation is needed. Efforts can be made to establish buy-in from all stakeholders if it isn't already there. A self-report measure must be feasible in regards to the time and effort required of athletes and practitioners, in addition to the associated financial costs. Who will be involved? How often will staff meet to discuss the self-report data? It is important for sports to consider both the initial investment needed to set up the measure and monitoring process, and ongoing costs of maintaining the measure, such as software updates, and interpreting and applying the data, practitioner time. If you have progressed through these earlier steps and decided a self-report measure is feasible, the next step is working out which measure to use. First, look to see if there is an existing measure validated in the literature which meets your needs. If you decide to go down the custom measure path, consider how important validity and reliability are. Reflecting back on the systematic reviews earlier, single item custom measures were less sensitive and reliable than validated questionnaires. Empirical measures are a safe and easy choice, as they've already developed and have been shown to have satisfactory validity and reliability. But they tend to be longer and only focus on a couple of dimensions. Custom measures may be a good alternative if you're willing to put in the work. There is a risk of perpetuating error if less valid and reliable measures are repeatedly used and published. This table summarizes the self-report measures currently available in the literature, which are provided for your information or future reference. Some measures only assess one dimension, and others assess 2 or 3. Mood, stress, recovery, fatigue, and symptoms have all been shown to be responsive to training load. To allow for individual variation and cover your bases, a multidimensional measure may be a better choice. Scales and items may relate to general symptoms, for example, I was fed up with everything, or be sport-specific, for example, I felt frustrated by my sport. It may be argued that sport-specific items are more applicable to and better received by athletes. Alternatively, the argument that the training response also manifests as general signs and symptoms suggests general items or a composite measure may be more appropriate for athlete monitoring. The total number of items and how often the measure is intended to be used are other things to consider at a practical level. Then you have the choice of how the measure will be implemented. There are several commercial products available, or you can develop a system in-house. So let's discuss how to effectively implement a self-report measure. To illustrate how implementation is crucial, I pulled some data from Cricket Australia. First, some context on how cricket in Australia is structured. Cricket Australia is the overarching organisation under which there are 7 state cricket associations. Each state cricket association may then have elite, pathway and franchise teams. All players across all state teams have the same access to the athlete monitoring software. They can complete their daily wellness via the website, an app, or an Apple Watch. The wellness questionnaire has 5 questions which they rate on a scale 1 to 5, where 3 is normal. First, to look at how many players are completing their daily wellness, I looked at a random week mid-season across 7 elite squads at 2 different points in time. In 2021, the compliance across 7 squads was about 80 to 100%. So in 2021, the states agreed to a performance plan overseen by Cricket Australia, which required all players to complete their daily wellness. States had to implement strategies to ensure players completed their daily wellness. Compliance is only one aspect and is useless if players aren't entering accurate information. So to tease out if players were entering accurate information, I looked at whether players always reported a 3 out of 5, which was normal, or whether their responses varied over the course of the season. So in 2021, where we have compliance at 80 to 100%, 10% of these players across all squads were always reporting a 3. So we probably say that their data wasn't very accurate. So this left about 90% of players who are probably giving thought to their responses. The players may still feel like they are doing it because they have to, rather than really buying into it though. In 2025, on the right, compliance for one squad in orange remained relatively good, whilst other squads went close to 0. So in 2025, wellness measures are not part of the agreed performance plan, and states can choose even how they implement strategies around players completing their daily wellness. So in 2025, you can be fairly confident that the players who choose to complete their daily wellness are doing so accurately and because they feel there is a benefit to them. This comparison between 2021 and 2025 demonstrates that the environment surrounding the measure is far more important than the measure itself, which has been the same for over 10 years. It may also reflect that the self-report measure may have run its course. Players who have been entering their daily wellness for years may now be better in tune with themselves and feel that they don't need to fill in the data on an app every day to recognise how they're feeling and if they need to go chat to a coach or support staff. So moving back to the research on implementation, the key outcomes we're after when implementing a self-report measure are compliance and data accuracy. The many factors which affect these outcomes were derived from the interview study I mentioned previously of the 30 elite Australian athletes, coaches and support staff. We synthesised all their comments about their experience with self-report measures into factors relating to the measure on the left of the figure and factors relating to the social environment on the right of the figure. Before I go through them, I will point out that technology has advanced in the 10 years since this research was completed, so technological barriers which led to these factors may be less relevant today, but still worth considering as part of the checklist of a good measure. Factors related to the measure. Mode, this refers to paper, website or app. Paper-based has some simple charm in a 1-to-1 athlete to staff ratio. But these days, technology is so accessible and there is a network of coaches and support staff to keep in the loop. I'm fairly confident in saying an app is the mode of choice. Accessibility. Most athletes will have a smartphone with internet connectivity, so in the daily training environment, this isn't a key factor. However, if internet connectivity is an issue, such as traveling internationally, then the app needs to work offline and sync when reconnected. Compatibility. If an app is used, it needs to be available for both Apple and Android operating systems. Compatibility also relates to other monitoring devices, such as automatically incorporating sleep and heart rate data from a watch or ring. Interface. This refers to a user-friendly design, so an intuitive process with a minimum number of clicks. And also making sure the app is visually appealing and seems professional, but not too clinical. Question design factors. This links back to what questions are being asked and how they are worded. Does the athlete understand the question? Does the question seem relevant to the athlete? Athletes prefer to respond quickly on a scale, but there should also be a free text box somewhere to give the athlete a space to explain a response. For example, an athlete may rate their fatigue higher than normal, but then the athlete comments, "fire alarm at 2 a.m. This gives the staff reviewing the self-report data a head start on interpreting the data. Time burden? Of course, keeping this minimum. Even if athletes seem to have plenty of time to spend on their phone, they don't want this to be a barrier. Timing of completion? This depends on the measure and intended purpose. If staff want to review how athletes are before training, then timing of completion needs to reflect this. For example, complete when you first wake up, or complete at breakfast. If staff want to review how athletes coped with the day's training, then they may ask athletes to complete it at the end of the day before bed. Similarly, weekly measures may be before the first session of the week if used to guide training that week, or at the end of the training week if used to reflect on the week. Either way, a consistent time is needed to help establish a habit, and so over the longer term, data is more meaningful. Data output and analysis. For staff, this may mean automated alerts of any responses which deviates from an individual's normal or exceed a predetermined threshold. A dashboard is also useful to give staff a quick overview of how an athlete or group of athletes is tracking. For athletes, a dashboard can be useful to reinforce behaviours related to training, 24/7 behaviours, and completing the self-report. And this can also encourage self-regulation. Moving to factors associated with the social environment. At the organisational level, data security is the key factor. This encompasses the security where data is stored online and also who has access to the data. Carefully consider which staff need access to the raw data to perform their role, and which staff may just need a staff member to relay the key information to them rather than having access themselves. Sports settings which have successfully implemented a self-report measure have one key staff member who drives this. This means they oversee athlete compliance and data quality, and they oversee the feedback given to athletes. Whilst one key staff member is driving the process, all staff need to buy in. Peer influence relates to both athletes and staff, so it is really about creating a positive culture around self-report. It only takes one loud negative voice to make others question the process, and this may undermine the whole process. Reminders. These can take many forms, such as in person at training, or via email or text message. With the use of apps, this can be automated to some degree, although staff should still be involved, as automated alerts are easy to choose to ignore. Reinforcement. Interviewees mentioned a few methods of reinforcement, whether positive or in the form of punishment. Ultimately, these are to the detriment of data accuracy and long-term compliance. So instead, reinforcement should just be part of the routine process of giving feedback to athletes. Athlete buy-in. It's critical for the long-term compliance and data accuracy. Steps to develop athlete buy-in are education about the purpose of the measure, the specifics of the questions, who will be looking at their data, and how the data will be used to their benefit and not used to their detriment. Regular feedback then needs to reinforce these points. As you can see, there is a lot to consider, so this needs careful thought and discussion amongst all staff, including the coach, support staff, and their managers. Once the measure is established, practitioners can play a role in supporting the process of athlete self-regulation by engaging in co-regulation. Encourage accountability and engage in discussions which guide the athlete to self-reflect, plan, and act effectively. To summarise what I've covered today, I've gone back to the questions I posed on the agenda. So first up, the theory. We covered why monitor athletes. Ultimately, it's to attempt to have a greater understanding and control over the many factors which influences how an athlete responds. What are we trying to monitor with self-report? The signs and symptoms which reflect where an athlete is on the athlete response continuum. Is self-report any good? Well, self-reported symptoms are sensitive and consistent in how they respond to changes in training load, and this allows the detection of expected and unexpected responses. Are there other benefits of self-report? Well, communication, coordinated approach amongst all stakeholders, confidence and athlete self-regulation. And are there contraindications to using self-report? Well, there are some individual characteristics which are contraindications, also a lack of staff expertise or poor implementation. Putting this into practice, how to decide if self-report is suitable for your sports setting. You could work through the flowchart I presented, working through the questions related to the purpose, stakeholder engagement, and feasibility. How to choose a self-report measure? Well, considering the above points, you then have to balance these against empirical or custom options. And then how to effectively implement self-report? You can work through the checklist of factors related to the measure and the social environment. So there's a bit to self-report. What's the takeaway message? In summary, we know it is important to consider how an athlete is feeling and responding to tailor their training and get the most out of them. Self-report is the best measure to capture signs and symptoms of the athlete response. But it depends on the context if a self-report measure is going to be a good tool. Very generally speaking, self-report measures may be better for developing athletes who are still learning how to understand and manage their bodies, and perhaps who don't have the confidence to go up to staff and say something is off and discuss how their training may need to be altered from the group. Also, athletes in a team setting who may not have as close of a relationship with their coach and support staff. But it is over to you to consider the specifics of the athletes that you work with, the staff involved, and resources available to decide if a self-report measure is a good choice. Arigatou gozaimasu.